importance that lived expertise, research, Indigenous leadership, and government plays in our decision-making process. So speaking to the Homeward Trust Board of Directors a little bit more, really their function is to advance the organization's mission and our overall strategic direction. So it's a monitoring role, specifically around fiduciary oversight, strategy, and accountability of administration, and ensuring that we are compliant to our funders. Like I said, 4 of the 9 members identify as Indigenous currently and are nominated through the Indigenous Nominating Committee. There's a requirement that minimum 4 out of 9, but oftentimes we've had more than that on the Homeward Trust Board of Directors. That Indigenous Nominating Committee that I spoke to is comprised of so a member from the Board of Directors, the Ote Pimisiwak Métis government representative. Sorry, I'm getting used to that one. I've called them the Métis Nation for forever, but I'm getting better at learning how to say it. A Treaty 6 representative, a Treaty 8 representative, and in the past it's been the Canadian Native Friendship Centre representative or another Indigenous community group as decided by the Board of Directors. So this is the Project Review Committee. It is part of the community advisory boards that comprise Homeward Trust. The community advisory boards, well, one community advisory board is a requirement of the Reaching Home funding received by the Government of Canada. You know, that said, Homeward Trust prefers to go above and beyond and have developed 2 with very unique functions. So speaking to the Project Review Committee, you know, they review and assess all proposals and applications and evaluations submitted to Homeward Trust to advise on if applications are aligned with the community plan priorities. Community plan in the past has been like the 10-year plan to prevent and end homelessness in Edmonton, the updated plan, and then some of you folks might be aware of the community plan that Homeward Trust recently worked on in 2023, 2024, and is likely to be released here quite shortly. And some of our other guiding documents that you can find on our website. They provide advice on if applications for are financially and operationally feasible and sustainable. That's a really big one. We'll speak to like the weighing criteria a little bit later in the presentation, and if any action is warranted in response to evaluations of funded initiatives. Speaking to the composition of that Project Review Committee, it's comprised of housing experts across all levels of government, community-based organization leadership, financial institutions, you know, such as specifically focused on housing, and leaders in the LGBTQ2S+ community, alongside lived experts. So lived experts of experiences of experiencing houselessness. And that's, you'll see that we have that representation on both of our community advisory board committees, and really value, you know, the unique insights that that community brings to those committees. All right, so the Indigenous Advisory Council advises Homeward Trust on all matters relating to Indigenous people. So anything that we do that is going to affect Indigenous people experiencing houselessness in Edmonton will go through either for, you know, information, for discussion, or recommendation to the Indigenous Advisory Council. And their function is to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into their recommendations, their approval, and their feedback of initiatives. So when they review and assess proposals and applications to Homeward Trust, really their function is to assess and make a recommendation if it meets the needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people living in urban communities, specifically Edmonton, and determine whether the proposal contributes in a culturally relevant manner to addressing the needs of Indigenous peoples here in Edmonton. So they really have that deeper consideration for how it's going to benefit Indigenous people who identify as Indigenous who are experiencing houselessness. You know, we'll speak to the composition a little bit later, but you know, if they're like, what's oftentimes we'll receive applications from non-Indigenous organizations. And so understanding the inequities within housing here in Edmonton and across Canada, the IEC plays a really crucial role in assessing whether or not those non-Indigenous organizations have a really clear and really strong plan to partner with Indigenous organizations or Indigenous leadership to ensure that there is culturally relevant programming and that Indigenous people are going to be well supported at these supportive housing sites as well too. So speaking to the composition, you know, it's reflective of a broad range of Indigenous perspectives and experiences. So that's like First Nations, Métis, Inuit, lived experiences of houselessness, you know, women's serving organizations, etc. We also have membership from Red Road Healing Society, which is the Indigenous community entity for Reaching Home's Indigenous stream of funding. So there's two streams for Reaching Home. There is the general stream, which Homeward Trust receives, and then there's the Indigenous specific stream that Red Road Healing Society receives. It's very important that they sit on the Indigenous Advisory Council and obviously connect with Homeward Trust in a number of different ways, really to eliminate any duplication of services, but also ensuring that there's no gaps. No gaps are being created when we're developing programming. So informing each other, being aware of what's happening within community, so that Indigenous peoples experiencing or at risk of experiencing houselessness are being served as best that they can. And we're working together as a system. So the Indigenous Circle, it's an expansion of the IEC, and it's hosted by the council. Membership includes, so really like their function is providing a space for Indigenous leaders to inform Homeward Trust's approach to specific issues and topics. So where like the Indigenous Advisory Council would review everything that comes through Homeward Trust, the IEC identifies specific topics and issues that require a broader range of perspectives, require a broader range of experiences and voices to contribute to the work that we're doing. You'll look at some of the membership there. We host it on a quarterly basis, typically. And I wanted to speak to the Indigenous Circle because like we're constantly working to make our RFP process more inclusive. We're not saying that it's perfect, and we're continually trying to improve it. The Indigenous Circle is an area where we would like to discuss how we can make this RFP process and this review process more accessible. You know, talking about different ways folks could submit RFPs, you know, how we can bolster the RFP review process as well. So if that's something that you're interested in attending and would like to be one of those experts or leaders who inform our RFP process, among many other topics, I'll include my contact information at the end of this presentation, and feel free to send me a message. I think we'll have an upcoming one either later November or early December. That's my part of the presentation. And so I'll hand it off to Jeff. And once we wrap up, we will we'll answer any questions. And Jeff, just since I'm sharing the presentation, just let me know when you want to go to the next slide.
Thanks, Liam. Great, thanks for that. Yeah, so I really appreciate kind of that level setting context of some of the structure and collaboration that happens. I'm here mostly to speak a bit about some of the kind of technical approach to how we go about both identifying procurement opportunities, identifying underserved or overrepresented populations, and then a little bit about what to actually expect if you were an organization that was responding to an RFP, and how we go about some of the technical assessment and review of that to ultimately lead to contracting of services in the community. So I'll just kind of start here by talking briefly about this concept of how, as a community, we go about identifying procurement opportunities. And really the task here is finding and acknowledging the right program for the right person at the right time, and that applies to all the programming we do, but especially when we're looking at opportunities to invest in different areas or expand opportunities for new programming. So one of the things, I think, as Liam's described in some of our governance structure, particularly our committee structure, representation from really all three levels of government, from Indigenous leaders, from community agencies that are doing this work, really is an important part of helping Homeward Trust understand the landscape by which we're working in. And just to kind of further that, I've got some examples here around how some of these kind of system planning nodes, or from a system planning perspective, how we lean into some of this partnership and data to help identify. So Liam referenced earlier that our by name list, some folks on the call might be familiar, but by name list is a really a critical core component of our collective understanding of the state of homelessness and community need around homelessness. So that's obviously a really useful tool when we're looking at responding to housing needs in our community. An example of this might be, as again, with by name list being real-time data, if we're seeing changes in for example, individuals with really significant barriers to accessing housing, or really complex housing needs that maybe are identifying as Indigenous through demographic information collection, that tells us as a system planning body that a gap is the need for higher intensive supports for Indigenous people, or supportive housing opportunities for Indigenous people, as an example. Cross-sector communication, we talked a little bit about, representation in some of those formal committees, but really this is a tool and a insight that helps us really leverage some of those planning tables to understand where there's investment coming into this system from, other systems, for example, health or corrections or otherwise, so that really helps inform risk of duplication of services, or just inability to augment or expand on what's already going into community in terms of investment, and not to, like I said, duplicate. So some examples of that is, recent investment around veterans homelessness, or women and children fleeing domestic violence, experiencing homelessness. Those areas that are seeing increased investment, which is great, and we want to be aware of and mindful of that as we're identifying procurement opportunities through Homeward Trust. Liam referenced some of the kind of core guiding documents, Edmonton's Homelessness and Housing Services Plan, Community Plan to End Homelessness material. These are really roadmaps for our collective impact. And I think, this really, for example, in that instance, it calls on us as a community to respond to homelessness in the fashion of really investing further into supportive housing, affordable housing, diversion and prevention models. These are areas that, as a community, we've identified a gap, and again, as an input into our planning, that's an important part to know where community need is. And then lastly, just around constantly understanding and being aware of new and emerging and innovative practices across Canada, across really overseas as well. What's working, what's new, what's better ways to do this work more efficiently. And there's some great examples of that over the years. For example, bridge housing as a model that's come into our system recently over the last handful of years, that really kind of makes it easier to go from unsheltered to permanent housing, and kind of bridging that experience of unsheltered homelessness into permanent housing. And another example being, investment into peer diversion, peer supported diversion work is an area that I think is really an emerging leading practice in some of these areas. So all of those are examples of kind of contributors that help us better understand what community need is to help us identify procurement opportunities. Liam, you can move to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So kind of further to that, it's one thing to acknowledge where community gap is and where further investment is needed, but it's another to understand who really are we seeking to serve, who's the end user of the housing program or the investment that we're looking to procure. So again, similar kind of concepts around really, again, leveraging that by name list data to paint a picture or better understand. An example of that would be by name list data would inform what inflow into homelessness versus outflow into homelessness, and if we're seeing specific demographics that are being impacted disproportionately in those areas. Examples being youth experiencing homelessness or families, and help us to acknowledge that those are populations that aren't being particularly well served within our current system. So how do we then invest in programming that's more specifically targeted or prioritizing those demographics? Similarly, that cross-sector communication, a really good example of this would be identifying, in partnership with our health system planners, increased pressures in emergency rooms, increased pressures in inpatient stays, and so on as a response to that's a really challenging community concern, and those individuals who are experiencing homelessness or houselessness in that setting, that could very well indicate a need to further invest or prioritize that population when we're developing or designing programming or procurement. And then lastly, I would just comment, community resource distribution. So an example of this is how do we best understand, again, what is going into community from other levels of government or other ministries, and contribute meaningfully or augment meaningfully that investment. So you may know, as an example, a great deal of investment has recently gone into expanding our emergency shelter system in Edmonton, and acknowledging that many, if not all, of the individuals accessing emergency shelter are in need of housing support. So really looking at ways to augment that expansion to better meet the housing needs of those using that service as an example of kind of aligning community resources. Further to that, on the right side of the slide, just kind of as we lean more into acknowledging who the procurement opportunity is seeking to serve, as an example, if we've identified the need to procure a supportive housing program, we would be really clear on what we mean by supportive housing and who that's seeking to serve. So supportive housing, for example, in our system is one of, if not our most intensive housing service. So we really want to make sure that any model or proposal that's seeking to really implement supportive housing is actually meeting the needs of those highest intensity folks, to maximize the use of those spaces and make sure we're having the most impact we possibly can. And as a result, as we describe prioritizing for supportive housing, there's some examples of really as an individual, who would be the end user of that program. So we acknowledge that if there's folks that need that higher intensity service, how we might then design a procurement opportunity to request models that would meet those needs specifically. So that's an example of one of the streams. And I think, largely we're focusing a bit on supportive housing through this presentation. So Liam, you can advance the slide. So this one, quite simply, is just typically what a proponent would experience in terms of the flow of or phasing of a procurement opportunity. So largely, as quite simply, the community would experience an RFP release. This is typically done through a distribution list, as well as posted publicly on our website and through other kind of media channels. We would typically host a session around procurement information. So interested proponents would participate in kind of an information session and question and answer period. Of course, that includes some deadlines around when the absolute latest we would be able to receive a proposal. The next phase really is that review and evaluation effort. So again, Liam provided a great deal of context around the role of our Indigenous Advisory Council and our project review committee, but largely internally, Homeward Trust will have a procurement review or RFP review committee, which is led by our administrative staff. It's typically our senior leadership group, and then a functional leader that's working most closely in that space of programming. It's important to note that while the role of committees is very much to guide and ask questions and ensure that we're being diligent around our assessment and our review, Ultimately, they're advising and guiding us on that, and the role of Homeward Trust administration is ultimately to select the operator with those insights and considerations. Lastly, it's again in terms of role delineation, Homeward Trust administration's role is to select an operator, but ultimately the approval comes from our board of directors. So they're the ones ultimately responsible for awarding the contract based on a recommendation from our administrative staff. We also really, I think, in the interest of transparency and equity, there's always and needs to be an opportunity for proponents that have applied that were not successful in the procurement cycle to receive feedback and to learn more about perhaps why their proposal wasn't selected during this cycle. So kind of quick and dirty rundown of the process. Liam, you can advance the slide. So getting a bit more technical, part of our engagement with our committees, for example, happens in a couple of different ways. There's an initial eligibility criteria review for all proposals regardless. And this is an exercise of really ensuring that the proponents and the proposals received do in fact meet the core kind of objectives of the RFP. So this is an exercise of working really closely with our committees and essentially determining a binary yes or no for each proposal. So for example, number one is the proposal aligned with community and system priorities. Alongside our committee, we would be discussing and essentially assigning a yes or no to that question. And then so on and so forth is, for example, 3, does the proposal have a significant impact on priority populations as described within the RFP? Again, it's a yes or no exercise. So this is very much a kind of a thresholding process by which really only proposals that are meeting these core objectives of the procurement are then advanced to a more technical and scoring-based assessment of the work. And again, this is led by Homeward Trust administration, but is deliberated and I think in great detail with our project review committee and Indigenous Advisory Council. You can advance it, Liam. Okay. This, I think fairly simply, this is as in terms of a flow. As we go through that initial eligibility process with our committees, those proposals that are confirmed as being eligible and being in alignment with the procurement opportunity, then going through a process of technical assessment and scoring of their proposals. So largely we have 5 scoring criteria or categories. They're weighted as kind of described here. A little bit of a description around what in fact those entail. Largely, this looks like an exercise of assigning a score from 1 to 3. 1 or 3 being a full or complete demonstration of for example, financial feasibility, cost effectiveness, and clear budget narrative. That we would, as a collective, as a internal review committee, assign a score based on like I said, a 1 to 3 scale. 1, and then of course 1 being a limited or no demonstration of that category. The result of this is kind of a collective weighted score for each proposal, and that helps inform that final decision making around contract award. Prior to making that recommendation to our board of directors, we again would engage our Indigenous Advisory Council and Project Review Committee to summarize our approach and to really kind of demonstrate diligence around our internal review and scoring of each of the projects. We would be seeking essentially confirmation from committees that we've considered all possible options and bring forward then that final recommendation to our board of directors for contract approval. And I think that's it. Liam, you can advance the slide. I'm just kind of looking at notes. I think I've covered the most of it. I know that's maybe a little more technical than we might have needed, but anyways, we'll kind of stop there. Liam, if you want, I'm not sure if you're going to host the Q&A, but I'll mute myself for now.
Yeah. So if you're able to, there's a raise hand function on Microsoft Teams, and then it tells me who raised their hand first, and then we can do it that way. Yeah, Cindy.
Hi, my name is Cindy Breland. I work for Nitawasin. I do programming, so I work with Indigenous women fleeing domestic violence. But my question is, with Edmonton's 10-year plan to end homelessness from 2009 to 2019, help reduce homelessness by nearly half, housing over 8,500 people and creating hundreds of supported housing units. However, homelessness has risen again, prompting a new strategy in 2024. The key achievements was to reduce it by 50%, housing 8,500 people that were housed, providing 644 units of supported housings were developed. But my question is, with the challenges and unfinished goals, right, like chronic homelessness was not fully eliminated by 2022. Targets set in the updated plan from Homeward Trust, along with the COVID-19 pandemic, reversed progress. Encampment and visible homelessness increase, especially in the central Edmonton, highlighting gaps in shelter and housing capacity. My question is, like, relocating resources from short-term interventions to permanent housing solution. My question is how do we close that gap to end chronic homelessness and prevent future homelessness, building integrated systems of care? My question is, with all this data that was accumulated, there still seems to be a gap between permanent housing and temporary housing. It seems to me, and I was born and raised in Edmonton, spent all my life in Edmonton. I can speak on, I grew up in the inner city. I see it. I know now with the changeover in the city of Edmonton, we have a new mayor now, and he allocated, day shelters. But my question is, you can have day shelters, but it gets colder at 3 o'clock in the morning. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, how do we develop programming that empowers Indigenous populations, right, that will kind of help these people from not be homeless? My question is, how do we work together, right, like on ground level, to actually see the improvements? So far, I've not, and this is where I think, especially with Indigenous women fleeing domestic violence, there seems to be a bigger gap in that. I can speak to it on a personal level because 2 years ago, when I left my abuser, I reached out to every organization. I'm not going to go into detail, but there was barriers that permitted me from achieving a place. So my question is, I can only speak on behalf of Indigenous women who flee domestic violence. There is a real huge gap. So my program, I want to work with your organization to create a program. Now we can now work with you guys. So say, for example, on our sharing circles, when a woman comes, just led a domestic violence situation, how can we best support these women so that they're not turned away? and it goes in with the encampments. Women are more apt to get abused, killed in an encampment. How do we protect our women? Right? So my question is, how do we, I guess, kind of track? Do you guys go 3, 6, and 12 months later after this person is housed to say, okay, she's been, got a job, raised her family, is working now? Do you know what I mean? Have you used case studies for an actual improvement, especially when it comes to Indigenous women fleeing domestic violence?
Yeah, that is a good question. It's a big question. I want to try and answer what I'm able to, and I think probably Jeff can take over anything that I'm forgetting. And it's really good to hear that, you're interested in working with Homeward Trust. I'd love to get your contact information, or feel free to message me after this presentation here. But so you spoke to like programming that empowers people not to experience houselessness or homelessness in the first place. And I think that it really goes into like that diversion upstream support space. And you were seeing, and I'm pretty hopeful of this, but seeing not just Indigenous organizations step into this space, but nations, along with like the Métis settlements, really focusing in on the urban centers and understanding that people have been migrating to urban centers for a long time due to the systemic barriers and inequity, due to colonization that exists within Canada, and are really taking it upon themselves to come into these urban centers and support not just their members of their nation, but all Indigenous peoples who require supports within an urban setting. So, I think like Enoch is like a great example of that, and Tall Cree I think is a really great example of that as well. And there's many others that I'm not naming, but I think that obviously goes upstream and what supports are there, and it's lobbying and conversations with the government of Canada to address like the systemic barriers that are being experienced, not just on reserve or Métis settlements or within Inuit communities, but within urban centers as well too. So I think it's collaboration. I think it's those nations, those settlements, the agencies, systems planners such as Homeward Trust coming together and having these conversations with each other to understand where those gaps are. We're all experts in our different fields and have different areas that we focus on, but they're all interweaved, right? Jeff spoke to, the increase in hospital beds being used, and, you've spoken to women fleeing violence. And so by having these dialogues with each other and understanding where those gaps are and where the support is needed and how we can support each other before it gets to that situation where somebody's experiencing houselessness, I think, I don't want to say like that is the answer, but I think it's part of it. You spoke to like Edmonton's 10-year plan and our update, and then the work that we've been doing on the community plan most recently. And yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. Like we made a lot of aspirational commitments to reducing chronic or to eliminating chronic homelessness. But as we know, like the world completely changed with COVID-19. There was unprecedented, factors such as an increase in encampments due to a variety of different reasons. People not feeling safe at shelter, people not wanting to go to shelter, not wanting to be exposed to COVID. And we've heard a lot of that feedback, through having conversations with people with lived expertise. Part of that community plan that we worked on, like the heart of that plan was an engagement with I think it was over 300 individuals currently experiencing houselessness, which was conducted by Indigenous consultancy firm Pitagwan. And really that informed a lot of the work that we had put into that community plan. It's like I said, it hasn't been released yet. And it's not like it's going to be like a set in stone, this is the answer to everything, but it's something that was developed in collaboration with community, with government, with people with lived expertise. And it continues to be, the hope is that it's a living document that gets informed by Indigenous leaders, such as yourself, through the means of, the Indigenous Circle, the IC, things like that. So,
is there a comprehensive plan in terms of educating the non-Indigenous people to colonialism through the residential school system? Because most of the people who suffer from addiction is the result of the residential school. How do we change the views on non-Indigenous people? Is there an educational, I know there is some cross training between, government will do some cultural training, but still when I go about, there's still racisms, there's all those isms. How do we collectively change society to say, look, everybody's one paycheck. You guys are. When funding gets cut, I've worked with nonprofits. Funding gets cut, my job goes. We're one paycheck away from being homeless ourselves. So how do we collectively, I guess, educate them, not change that view of Indigenous people to say, look, they were here prior to colonialism, prior to contact, and they lived sustainably. So maybe we should look historically to say, okay, we collectively, if somebody, was hungry, we fed our people. Do you see what I'm saying? How can we, as a community, change those views, especially now in a political unrest, provincially, federally, municipally is now I give our new mayor credit for injecting that funding into day shelters, but he's just putting a Band-Aid on a infection that has been there for years, right? But how do we change it? There's like 11 of us here already. It's a start, but how do we individually start changing things?
I'll maybe I have a couple of comments in response to Cindy's previous question, and then I think, if there's other folks mindful of, we've got 10 minutes as well. So I think, Cindy, to your previous question, one of the things I would say really confidently is we know as a community that the solution to homelessness is housing, and that we really are in an environment right now where we need to have the discipline to, you commented around, investing in short-term solutions versus long-term solutions. And I think one of the things we've learned post-pandemic and in our current environment is that there's an urgency, an increased urgency around, investing in kind of this crisis response. Everything is a crisis response. And I think the homeless serving sector has really disproportionately felt some of that crisis response. And as a result, it's really leaned into, a change in government priorities and how we're as a community responding to homelessness. So there's kind of this tension between, we acknowledge there's folks that are really in terrible situations and are at risk of, horrible outcomes while they're unhoused. But ultimately, the solution to that is to enhance or invest in permanent housing solutions, and that's an area that we'll continue to advocate for and really want to bring to the forefront in any of our kind of collaborative conversations. And then the other thing I would just comment to around your comments about data and what we do with data. I think one of the things that's important to know about Homeward Trust role in data is we're very much in a data stewardship role. It's not our data by any means. Our role is to consolidate and support that data to inform decision making through really, like, as much as possible, a democratization of data. It's community data. We want to make it as available as possible. That's done through, our by name list our data, our point in time count, homelessness data. Really, those are intended to be public facing indicators of the kind of the current state of homelessness, and we really strive to make sure that there's community access to those type of resources as much as possible. So anyways, any other questions? We've got, I think, 7 minutes left in our session.
I have a quick question. Do you guys now work with the city of Edmonton? Like, are you going to, and we know, right? Are you working in tandem with the chief of police to stay, okay, destroying people's, like, where are they gonna go? Yeah, you can move them from one area, but it's spread out now. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do we, are you guys working with the city police now with the new mayor, or now are you going to be working collaboratively with them to now say, okay, we need concrete resolution to some of these crises?
Yeah, I would say
not yet.
Yeah, well, no, we certainly do. We work really, really closely with city administration staff from a number of different branches, both in their infrastructure and affordable housing development spaces, as well as their service delivery, prevention, homeless response spaces. So, I think it's a partnership that's existed for a long time, and we continue to work really quite closely with them. Yeah, in terms of police response and so on, I think, again, I go back to my statement around in terms of how our communities experience some of the visible homelessness, particularly encampments previously. Again, we know, and we have been I think really consistent in our commitment to the response to unsheltered homelessness as housing, and that displacement or accommodating unsheltered homelessness is not necessarily, or really is not, the solution to permanently ending homelessness. So there's, I think, some history and some context in our community's response to those topics. But again, we've been very committed to working alongside city administration on a number of kind of core concerns.
Nancy has a question that she just put in the chat, asking what's the typical timeline between breaking ground on a supportive housing building and the final selection of an operator?
Yeah, so thanks, Nancy. One of the things, so with specifically supportive housing and some of our more recent procurement opportunities, we have worked really closely with the city as co-developers of supportive housing and purpose-built supportive housing. There was, for example, in 22-23, the Rapid Housing Initiative was a kind of a collaborative funding opportunity that we worked with alongside the city from federal capital. And in those instances, part of the eligibility of the capital funding was that the buildings or the construction would have to be in a rapid fashion. So in those instances, and in our most recent build in Holyrood, the construction timeline was really between 16 and 18 months, which is really quite, it is rapid. It's for programming, or sorry, for buildings of that scale, it's quite the feat. Largely speaking, our procurement timelines from the time of RFP release to the time we've had an operator selected, we strive for really kind of a 90-day window to do so. Sometimes we are delayed in doing so depending on kind of final construction and substantial occupancy of buildings as they come online. But again, our intention would be to really ensure that we have an operator contracted and ready to begin services as soon as possible once the lights are turned on, so to speak. So construction typically in those instances, 16 to 18 months. Those are projects that we co-developed with the city. And then in the instance of procurement timelines, really striving for a 90-day window.
Thanks, Jeff. If there are no other questions for right now, I would like to thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it, taking the time out of your day. You can contact either myself or Jeff if you have any additional questions. I will plug the Indigenous Circle one more time. We got a lot of really great questions, and I'm sure there's a lot of really great people here in this meeting here today. Feel free to send me a message if you're interested in joining that circle. Like I said, we meet on a quarterly basis. We provide food, but we really appreciate everybody's perspectives and really try and make that as diverse and as large as possible. So I'd be happy to host you guys there. Just send me a quick message saying that you're interested, and I'll make sure that you get the invite for the upcoming circle. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See ya.